You know, here in July 2016, while viewing all of this dismay that's going on in our country here in the USA, between the citizens and the police that are supposed to protect the citizens and help the citizens, and I figured that's the reason why they've been paid. Because of all the reports and all the shows that have been on and all the talk on social media, it reminded me of a vibe, a harsh, almost unbelievable situation that our country was a part of for many years up until 1965, for 75 years, called the Jim Crow laws. And that's what I want to share with you today here on the Topkats Rebel Connection. Topkats Rebel Connection. Well, before I get started with giving the information about the Jim Crow laws, I'm sure there's two words that's going to pop up. One is de jure and the other word is de facto. And I want you to know what that means actually before they are mentioned in the report. The word de jure, D-E-J-U-R-E, means a state of affairs that is in accordance with law, that is officially sanctioned. Now, this is in contrast to the other word that I mentioned, de facto, which means a state of affairs that is true in fact, but is not officially sanctioned. You see, in law and in government, the terms de jure and de facto are used instead of in law and in practice, respectfully. In the legal context, de jure laws are contrasted to de facto practices where, for example, the people obey a contract as though they were a law enforcing it, yet there's no such law. Now, the Jim Crow laws were state and local laws enforcing racial segregation in the southern United States, enacted after the Reconstruction period. These laws continued in force until 1965. They were mandated de jure racial segregation in all public facilities in states of the former Confederate States of America, starting in 1890 with a quote-unquote separate but equal status for African Americans. Conditions for African Americans were consistently inferior and underfunded compared to those available to white Americans. This body of law institutionalized a number of economic, educational, and social disadvantages. De jure segregation mainly applied to the southern states, while northern segregation was generally de facto patterns of housing segregation enforced by private covenants, bank lending practices, and job discrimination, including discriminatory labor union practices. Now, the Jim Crow laws mandated the segregation of public schools, public places, and public transportation, and the segregation of restrooms, restaurants, and drinking fountains for whites and blacks. The U.S. military was also segregated, as were federal workplaces, initiated in 1913 under President Woodrow Wilson by requiring candidates to submit photos. His administration practiced racial discrimination also in hiring. Now, these Jim Crow laws followed the 1800s through the 1866 Black Codes. And in other words, in the 1800s up until 1866, the Black Codes were in use under law in the United States. And after the Black Codes came the Jim Crow laws. And the Black Code laws come from the Slave Code laws. Well, these Jim Crow laws followed the Black Codes, which had previously restricted the civil rights and civil liberties of African Americans. Segregation of public, many people say state-sponsored schools, was declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States in 1954 in the Brown versus Board of Education. Generally, the remaining Jim Crow laws were overruled by the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but years of action and court challenges were needed to unravel numerous means of institutionalized discrimination. Furthermore, the phrase Jim Crow law can be found as early as 1892 in the title of a New York Times article about voting laws in the South. The origin of the phrase Jim Crow has been attributed to, quote unquote, Jump Jim Crow, a song and dance caricature of blacks performed by white actor Thomas D. Rice in blackface, which first surfaced in 1832 and was used to satirize Andrew Jackson's populist policies. Andrew Jackson is a former U.S. president. As a result of Rice's fame, Thomas D. Rice, Jim Crow, by 1838, had become a pejorative expression, meaning Negro. When Southern legislators passed laws of racial segregation directed against blacks at the end of the 19th century, these became known as Jim Crow laws. So, what about the origins of Jim Crow laws? Well, during the Reconstruction period of 1865 through 1877, federal law provided civil rights protection in the U.S. South for freed men, the African Americans who had formerly been slaves, and former free blacks. In the 1870s, Democrats gradually regained power in the Southern legislatures, having used insurgent paramilitary groups such as the White League and Red Shirts to disrupt Republican organizing, run Republican office holders out of town, and intimidate blacks to suppress their voting. Extensive voter fraud was also used. Gubernatorial elections were close and had been disputed in Louisiana for years, with increasing violence against blacks during campaigns from fraud. And also, in 1868 onward, in 1877, a National Democratic Party compromise to gain Southern support in the presidential election resulted in the government's withdrawing the last of the federal troops from the South. While Democrats had regained political power in every southern state, these southern white Democrat Redeemer governments legislated Jim Crow laws, officially segregating black people from the white population. Blacks were still elected to local offices through the 1880s, but the establishment Democrats were passing laws to make voter registration and electoral rules more restrictive, with the result that political participation by most blacks and many poor whites began to decrease. Between 1890 and 1910, 10 of the 11 former Confederate states, starting with Mississippi, passed 9 constitutions or amendments that effectively disenfranchised most blacks and tens of thousands of poor whites through a combination of poll taxes, literacy and compensation tests, and residency and record-keeping requirements. Grandfather clauses temporarily permitted some illiterate whites to vote but gave no relief to most blacks. As a result, voter turnout dropped drastically through the South as a result of such measures. In Louisiana, by 1900, black voters were reduced to 5,320 on the rolls, ROLLS, although they comprised the majority of the state's population. By 1910, only 730 blacks were registered, less than 0.5% of eligible black men. In 1927, of the state's 60 parishes, not a single black voter was registered any longer. In 9 more parishes, only 1 black voter was. The cumulative effect in North Carolina meant that black voters were completely eliminated from voter rolls during the period from 1896 through 1904. The growth of their thriving middle class was slowed. In North Carolina and other southern states, there were also the effects of invisibility. Within a decade of disenfranchisement, the white supremacy campaign had erased the image of the black middle class from the minds of white North Carolinians. Those who could not vote were not eligible to serve on juries and could not run for local offices. They effectively disappeared from political life as they could not influence the state legislators and their interests were overlooked. While public schools had been established by Reconstruction legislators for the first time in most southern states, those for black children were consistently underfunded compared to schools for white children, even when considered within the strained finances of post-war South, where the decreasing price of cotton kept the agricultural economy at a low. Like schools, Jim Crow public libraries were underfunded and often stocked with second-hand books and other resources. These facilities were not introduced for African Americans in the South until the first decade of the 20th century. Throughout Jim Crow, the libraries were only available sporadically. Prior to the 21st century, most libraries established for African Americans were school library combinations. Many public libraries for both white and African American patrons at the period in question, or should I say the period being mentioned, were founded as the result of middle-class activism aided by matching grants from the Carnegie Foundation. In some cases, progressive measures intended to reduce election fraud, such as the 8-box law in South Carolina, acted against black and white voters who were illiterate, as they could not follow the directions, while the separation of African Americans from the general population was becoming legalized and formalized during the progressive era, which was between the 1890s and 1920s. It was also becoming customary. For instance, even in causes in which Jim Crow's laws did not expressly forbid black people to participate in sports or recreation, a segregated culture had become common.
Topkats, rub That's just the way it goes. Gotta go and give it all you go. That's just the way it goes. Gotta go and give it all you go.
I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. Foot on the clutch and I won't let off. Never looking back at the time I lost. Gotta count my prayers, so many times that I should have been dead. Living in the dark when the light was shed. Hard to step away cause I'm comfy there. Feeling 10 feet tall, like a baller dog. When I'm on my game, I can have it all. Wrong step back fall, it's curtain call. Catch my drift, I'm just a pawn. In this game, gotta run before you cross. So I'm spitting like a track star. I don't know where I'm going, but I hope far. I'm stepping to the front like homie what? Spit with on my heart like it's fisticuffs. Every time I'm on stage, gotta rip it up. Let me live it up, let me get in my position. Feel the strength and see my vision. Hear my pain and zone out to the rhythm. Yeah, I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. We taking our position and never letting go. I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. We taking our position and now they yelling ho. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now.
I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. Carry that burden, I got your load. I'ma lift you up, speak up, be bold. I'm a man that be talking blunt, you better hear that truth. All it take is once, you better humble your mind. You've been blind for months, I made a pack a punch and put away your stunts. New day when you're here to live it, don't go for gimmicks. Don't be statistic, be the one to pick and be quick to pivot to the ones you love. I wanna see your spirit, I'ma help you be a believer. I can block the reaper, be your brother's keeper. I can be the teacher, even be the preacher. Get the devil either, I can help the weaker. This is a stronger vision and it deals with living plus one addition. It's free admission to the right religion, no competition to your position. You know, better get up, go. Don't waste no time, you're stronger if you let it shine. Don't waste no time, you're stronger if you let it shine. Don't waste no time, you're stronger if you let it shine.
I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. We taking our position and never letting go. I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. We taking our position and now they yelling ho. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now. Yeah, for another day did he let me breathe, and for another day did he let me live, and for another day did he let me see. Come on.
I'm getting stronger, okay. Right. I'm getting stronger my way. Right. I call it stronger living, and you know I'm driven. Anything that's given, call it stronger living.
Now I'm getting stronger every day. Right. Now I'm living better every week. Right. I'm going hard like every hour. I promise that you never catch me weak.
I'm getting stronger, okay. Right. I'm getting stronger my way. Right. I call it stronger living, and you know I'm driven. Anything that's given, call it stronger living.
Yeah, I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. We taking our position and never letting go. I'm talking stronger living, I'm talking stronger soul. We taking our position and now they yelling ho. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now, the world is screaming. Come on now, the world is screaming.
Topkats, Connection.
In the Jim Crow context, the presidential election of 1912 was steeply slanted against the interests of black Americans. Most blacks still live in the South, where they had been effectively disenfranchised, so they could not vote at all, while poll taxes and literacy requirements banned many poor or illiterate Americans from voting. These stipulations frequently had loopholes that exempted white Americans from meeting the requirements. In Oklahoma, for instance, anyone qualified to vote before 1866 or related to someone qualified to vote before 1866, a kind of grandfather clause, was exempted from the literacy requirements. Only the person who could vote before that year were white male Americans. White Americans were effectively exempted from literacy testing, whereas black Americans were effectively singled out by the law. Woodrow Wilson, former President Woodrow Wilson, was a Democrat elected from New Jersey, but he was the first Southern-born president of the post-Civil War period. He appointed Southerners to his cabinet. Some quickly began to press for segregated workplaces, although Washington, D.C. and federal offices had been integrated since after the Civil War. Wilson introduced segregation in federal offices despite protests from African American leaders and groups. He appointed segregationalist Southern politicians because of his own firm belief that racial segregation was in the best interest of black and white Americans alike. At Gettysburg, on July 4th, 1913, the semi-centennial of Abraham Lincoln's declaration that, quote, all men are created equal, unquote, Wilson addressed the crowd and said, how complete the Union has become and how dear to all of us, how unquestioned, how benign and majestic, as state after state has been added to this, our great family of free men. In Texas, several towns adopted residential segregation laws between 1910 and the 1920s. Legal strictures called for segregated water fountains and restrooms. Jim Crow laws were a product of what became the solidly Democratic South. White Southern Democrats exploited racial fear, attacking the corruption, real or perceived, of Reconstruction Republican governments and suppressing the black vote by violence and intimidation, had taken over state governments in the South in the 1870s and essentially dominated them for nearly 100 years. They disenfranchised most blacks through voter registration laws and new constitutions by the end of the 19th century. In 1956, Southern resistance to the Supreme Court's ruling in Brown versus Board of Education resulted in a resolution called the Southern Manifesto. It was read into the congressional record and supported by 96 Southern congressmen and senators, all but 2 of them Southern Democrats. And by the way, there were early attempts to break Jim Crow. And so that's what I want to wrap this up with, is the attempts and why it faltered. The Civil Rights Act of 1875, introduced by Charles Sumner and Benjamin F. Butler, stipulated a guarantee that everyone, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude, was entitled to the same treatment in public accommodations such as inns, like hotels, public transportation, theaters, and other places of recreation. This act had little effect. An 1883 Supreme Court decision ruled that the act was unconstitutional in some respects, saying Congress was not afforded control over private persons or corporations, with white Southern Democrats forming a solid voting bloc in Congress due to having outsized power from keeping seats apportioned for the total population in the South. Although hundreds of thousands had been disenfranchised, Congress did not pass another civil rights law until 1957. In 1887, Reverend W.H. Hurd lodged a complaint with the Interstate Commerce Commission against the Georgia Railroad Company for discrimination, citing its provision of different cars for white and black/colored passengers, the company successfully appealed for relief on the grounds it offered separate but equal accommodation. About 3 years later, in 1890, Louisiana passed a law requiring separate accommodations for colored and white passengers on railroads. Louisiana law distinguished between white, black, and colored. That is, people of mixed European and African ancestry. The law already specified that blacks could not ride with white people, but colored people could ride with whites. Before 1890, colored people could ride, meaning those people of mixed European ancestry. A group of concerned black, colored, and white citizens in New Orleans formed an association dedicated to rescinding the law. The group persuaded Homer Plessy, last name spelled Plessy, who was 1/8 Negro and of fair complexion, to test the situation. In 1892, Homer Plessy, bought a first-class ticket from New Orleans on the East Louisiana Railway. Once he had boarded the train, he informed the train conductor of his racial lineage and took a seat in the whites-only car. He was directed to leave that car and sit instead in the colorids-only car. Colorids only. Plessy refused, however, and was immediately arrested. The Citizens Committee of New Orleans fought the case all the way to the Supreme Court, but they lost in Plessy versus Ferguson. That was in 1896, in which the court ruled that separate but equal facilities were constitutional. The finding contributed to 58 more years of legalized discrimination against blacks and colored people in the United States. So that's a wrap as far as the Jim Crow laws and the history, for the most part anyway, or for a large part I should say, is concerned. And references for this bit is compiled from various points like the University of Georgia Press, 2004, The Strange Career of Jim Crow by Woodward C. Vane, Louisiana's Jim Crow Law Valid, New York Times, December 21st, 1892, as well as The Civil War in America, Memory by David W. Blight, Blight. And certainly not to forget from Fine Law and Stanford Law Review, as well as the United States Department of Justice. one thing I think that's important for us to keep in mind, especially in reference to all the information that I just shared with you about the Jim Crow laws and the slave laws and black laws, is that black people have been in America since 1619, at least. And if you can recall, the country wasn't even founded officially until 1776, underneath the Constitution, which still exists today. So that is 157 years prior that blacks, African Americans, whatever the name is properly in use today, that was 157 years before the country was even founded. So as of the year 2016, black have been a part of U.S. history and the life culmination of the country for 397 years as of July 2016. 400 years in 2019, from August 1619 to August 2019. That will be 400 years. So here, in just a few years, there'll be a 400-year anniversary. Although, according to history, 1640 was the first time that a black or a Negro or what have you was written into the books as an actual slave. Supposedly back then they were only indentured servants from 1619 up until 1640. But after this court hearing, because supposedly a slave who was an indentured servant had ran away with two other white indentured servants, since they had tried to run away, there was punishment, and the punishment for the black slave, or the black indentured servant, was for the black indentured servant to be a slave. And the two counterparts who had also tried to run away, who were also indentured servants, they had, as a penalty, a couple years or so added on their indentured servancy, and they had to, afterwards, after their duties as an indentured servant to a family, they had to work for the county for about 3 to 5 years. That was their penalty. So this is why I'm clarifying things. Although, nevertheless, blacks have been in America since 1619, but 1640 is when blacks became actual slaves as written into law. So what we'll say is from 1640 up until 1965, that's 325 years. 1965 is when Jim Crow was rescinded. That's when the law was rescinded in 1965. That's when it was over with. Remember, I had mentioned from 1890 to 1965. So when you go from 1640, from the time that we were just discussing with the slaves in Jamestown, or the particular slave that we're mentioning, from 1640 up to 1965 is 325 years. So for 325 years, there have been actual laws on the books in America to disenfranchise Negro, black, African American, whichever term is the proper one these days. There were actual laws on the books to make sure that there was no advancement as a whole of the culture economically. And also we know that those type of laws have psychological effects on people. Actual laws in the books to make sure that you could only rise so far as a whole. Of course, there are the twos and fews, but we're talking about as a societal mandate, 325 years. And in conclusion, here in 2016, this is July 2016, from 1965 up until 2016, that's 51 years. That's it. 51 years have been in effect since Jim Crow in the United States, and only 51 years since the slaves first were brought to Jamestown, but supposedly they were indentured servants. And 1640 is when it was actually on the books that a Negro or African-American slave, African-American indentured servant, pardon me again, was actually a slave. So from 1640, but 1619 is when Negroes, according to U.S. history, first arrived on the American shores. Sure, there's other history that you may know as well as that I do know and can show and prove even from European museums that have stored this knowledge in their institutions, but we'll just go from U.S. history. And I have to mention this because from what most people are taught in America, from my understanding and from my interacting with fellow citizens, I know that most of these facts aren't understood clearly. So I have to rehash all of these laws and statutes were in effect from the black codes to the slave codes to U.S. Jim Crow laws. All of this was in effect all the way up until 1965 as laws. And there's only been 51 years here in 2016 since Jim Crow ended in 1965 that there has not been actual laws on the books. At least I hope these laws are still on the books. I don't know. I haven't seen them. That's a great question to ask the local congresswoman or congressman. Have these laws been rescinded? But there's only been 51 years since there weren't laws actually on the books to make sure that African Americans or Negroes or blacks or coloreds or whatever the term is aren't able to climb up the social economical ladder and have loan opportunities and mortgage opportunities and fair treatment under the law. Only 51 years. And of course, we know that even though in 1965, when you look into history, you'll see that many people, many institutions in our country did not pay attention to the law. So 1965 is the date, but I would say it took about 5 to 10 more years before people, which make up institutions, people make up institutions and towns and ordinances. Even though the ordinances and towns and stuff like that are written, that doesn't mean that people are following them. So we can say that even during that time, we didn't get people to start paying attention to the law until 1970 or 1975. That's a very interesting and I hope insightful thought. So as you can see, the Jim Crow laws were actually state and local laws enforcing racial segregation in the southern United States. So for those of you that just thought that was a cliche saying or something like that, or perhaps you didn't think that that was a actual law or something like that, something official in our country, well, I hope that sheds a lot of light on the term for you, as well as the law. And I like to just have a little bit of an addendum to all of this, because the Jim Crow law and its era actually came after what was called the Black Codes. And this is an actual term that you can research, the Black Codes. The Black Codes, or the laws that gave force to the Black Codes, was passed by southern states in 1865 and 1866. So Jim Crow was actually after the Black Codes. And what was before the Black Codes was the slave codes. The slave codes. Now, these are all actual laws that are underneath these terms, these names. And the slave codes actually applied during slavery from at least 1640 up until 1863, or some would say up until 1865, and later on in the 1800s. because in 1863, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, giving freedom to the slaves. But of course, you know, many plantation owners and slave owners and all those types did not pay attention to the laws. It was something that they did not agree with and something that they just felt was wrong, so they didn't pay attention to the law. So even though the Emancipation Proclamation was signed by the president, many Negroes, blacks, African Americans, whatever you would like to say, remained slaves for quite a few years after that document was law. And that again was in 1863. As of the year 2016, blacks or Negroes or whatever the proper term is these days, from African slaves, or some would say indentured servants, who arrived in Jamestown, Virginia aboard a Dutch ship in August, have been a part of U.S. history and the life culmination of the country for 397 years. Thank you for joining me for this report and elaboration on the Jim Crow laws. And, you know, we had to throw in a little bit more into the pot, into the stew. But we hope that all of it was very interesting to you. And we'll look forward to you joining us back here again on the next report here at Spreaker.com/Topkats Airborne. Take care. This has been edutainment wrapped in eclectic music. I'm Otis Q. Pate, Airborne.